Okay, this is chapters 25 and 26. Chapter 25, The Discovery. I bet when Benjamin Pilsen first heard about Marie, he was excited. A young girl like that at the scene of the crime, I bet he thought he'd luck out. She would be easy to lean on and easy to fool. The entire class had to have felt like a golden egg cracked right into the entire case had to have felt like a golden egg cracked right onto his plate. I remember the day when he came back, walking into the station smelling like a game show host. I was on the main floor helping Bert clean up his desk. It was always a mess. Food wrappings and napkins from hurried lunches, coffee rings everywhere, and my dad harped on him sometimes, so I wanted to help. We all still felt bad about what had happened to a snake. As soon as the snow melted, my dad drove to the big pet shop in Brainerd to get him a new python, a trip that made for a few rare moments of levity. My dad had never looked so nervous during any prisoner transport as he did driving around with that snake. Pilsen came in as I was carrying out the trash. He glanced at me and I just sort of nodded, surprised to see him. He didn't bother nodding back and went in to speak with my dad. They must have made some calls, because before long our prosecutor, Mr. Norquist, arrived, and the Mr. Porter a few minutes later. "What in the world's he starting now?" Bert asked as we stood beside his desk. Pilsen wanted everyone to march up to Marie's cell. "She's just finishing her lunch, Rick," Bert said. "Why don't you let me go up and fetch her?" My dad nodded and Bert got up with the keys. "What's going on, Dad?" I asked, and he motioned for me to be quiet. Bert brought Marie down uncuffed. He kept a hand on her shoulder. "Into the interrogation room, please," Pilsen said. Marie frowned. "It'll be pretty damn crowded. Can't you just tell me out here?" At first, Pilsen seemed annoyed. The line on his forehead creased deep. Then that smile came back, and that was even worse. "That's what you want, Miss Hale," he said. "Or should I say Miss Menuz?" "Miss Menuz?" my dad asked. "Her name isn't really Marie Catherine Hale," Pilsen said. "It's Marie Catherine Muse. She was born in Greeley Country, Nebraska, to one Audrey Cody, formerly Muse, of North Platte. Mrs. Cody was reported missing some months ago, along with her husband, Nathaniel." I looked at Marie. I'd never been more afraid, not even when she was drenched in the Carlsons' blood. But every time Pilsen said the name Menuz, he flinched like he'd hit her. "Isn't that them?" he asked. "Your parents, Audrey and Nathaniel Cody, missing since early summer, and dead, according to you." "Yes," Marie said. "They're both dead." "But they aren't, are they? Or at least he isn't." What do you mean he isn't?" I asked. "I mean that Nathaniel Cody is our killer." He told us how he'd found him. It was a clue from the taped interviews. He'd been trying to trace Marie for months, calling orphanages and halfway houses, and combing through reports on missing girls. Then one night he was listening to the interviews and heard Marie say her stepfather claimed lineage to a famous local cowboy. It didn't take long for him to learn that Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show had been founded in North Platte. And once he had the name Cody, the rest was easy. Mr. Cody's employer had thought it odd when he failed to report for work on a Monday morning, and after he asked about the discovery and that his wife and stepdaughter were also nowhere to be found, he assumed that the family had picked up and moved on, as some folks do. It wasn't for another week that the landlady went by the house and noticed that nothing had been packed. Clothes still on the dresser, jewelry, and family photographs all left behind. "I always thought it was strange," he went on, "that no one came forward to claim you after your picture was all over the papers and shown on the news. But you looked a little different back then, meeker, and your hair longer and dull, flawed skin, and no smile, even for a photograph." He pulled a photo out of his jacket and flashed it at us. It was taken not more than a few years ago, and in it her hair was lighter and thinner. Dark spots marred her forehead and chin. It was different, but it was her. Marie looked like she wanted to claw his eyes out. "Is that true?" I asked. "I already told you it was," she said. "I already told you they were dead." "They were dead," Pilsen went on. "Isn't that what you said, they? But people in North Platte had a lot to say about your stepfather after they found out you were the one being held up here. Troubling things." "You shut your mouth." "What kind of troubling things?" Mr. Porter asked. "Nathaniel Cody had a proclivity for young girls. Marie's jaw and fists clenched. My dad caught on sooner than I did and whispered, "Good God." "He made a sort of pet of you, didn't he, Marie?" Pilsen said. "Buying you little presents, new outfits. You were plain, and he spruced you up. Maybe it was innocent enough at first, but then it changed. That's what your landlady said, Mrs. Marshall. She said maybe it was never your mother he was interested in the first place." Shut up. "Looking at you now, I can hardly blame him." "Shut up, shut up, shut up." Marie lunged for Pilsen with hooked fingers. Bert had to haul her back. He and my dad had to pin her to the floor and put her in cuffs, and she kept screaming those awful animal screams. "Put her in the interrogation room," Pilsen said. "I'm done. I'm not done with her yet." "No," Mr. Porter said. "You are done. You're done." "Take her back up, Bert," my dad said. "Keep the cuffs on and stay with her until I tell you different." Bert nodded. He looked terrified, wrestling her towards the stairs. She was furious, screaming and kicking. "Did you seduce him?" Pilsen called. "Did you help him kill your mother? Tell us where he is, Miss Muse. Don't you want her body found? Don't you want her to have a Christian burial?" He smiled the same smile he had on when he came in, until my dad put an arm across his chest and shoved him into the wall. "That is enough out of you, Mr. Pilsen. Get your hands off me. You come into my station and let all hell out?" My dad shoved him one more time. Pilsen's tie hung askew, and his top button had come loose. He straightened the tie angrily as my dad pointed for him to go through his office door. I followed them inside. Pilsen slapped a thin file folder on my dad's desk. My father picked it up and leafed through the pages. "Once we found her, everything fell into place," Pilsen said. "She and the stepfather embarked on some kind of affair that resulted in the death of the mother. From there, things spun out of control." My father cast him a disgusted look. "Around here, when a grown man takes up with a 15-year-old girl, we don't call it embarking on an affair," he said. "Where is he? Have you found him?" "Not yet. We've put out a bulletin. The Federal Bureau is sending men. Now that we know who we're looking for, he won't be able to hide for long." I stood to one side like wood. I had never heard the name Nathaniel Cody, but now I couldn't stop hearing it and imagining what he looked like. Tall and dark, handsome like a movie star. My dad closed the folder. "It's disturbing," Pilsen said, "but at least it's an explanation." But it wasn't the real explanation. Everything about it was wrong, even her name, Marie Catherine Muse. It was like they were talking about a different person. "Listen, Rick," Pilsen said, "you have to give me another run at her. Now, before she comes up with something new. We've already lost too much time." He glanced at me. They were embarrassing at having let the interviews go on for so long and listening to all that silly vampire talk. Only it wasn't silly. Nathaniel Cody hadn't been standing outside of my window. He hadn't been scaling trees and carving symbols into them. But my dad gave in. "Mr. Porter will need to be present." "Dad," I protested. "It'll be all right, Michael." "It won't be," I said quietly. I could have slugged Pilsen in the gut, yet he still had the gall to look at me with sympathy and to give my shoulder a squeeze. Then he went into the interrogation room. Pilsen questioned Marie for 2 hours. She shouted through most of it, but it was worse when she was quiet. I didn't want to think about the questions he was asking, filthy questions like he'd put to me before he'd left town, and I didn't want to think about the answers. When it was over, she came out looking like a ghost. I said her name, but she just walked through the station with Bert back up to her cell. To be fair, Pilsen came out not looking much better. He'd taken off his suit coat, and his underarms were dark with sweat. "So," my father asked, "is it like you said?" He nodded and wiped his face. "But she's not cooperating. She won't give him up." "It's been months," I said. "She doesn't know where he is." Pilsen looked at me annoyed. "The interviews will stop. There's no need for the expense of the tape recordings, and we can arrange for transport to Lincoln as soon as next week." "Hang on," my dad said. "There's been no new hearing." "And she's not finished," I said. "There's still more." "If she needs to confess more," Mr. Pilsen said, "she'll have a priest. You can't just take her. With this new information, her identity, the main subject, Nebraska has the better claim." With all due respect, Mr. Pilsen, that's for a judge to say, and the people of Black Deer Falls will disagree. We still don't know what went on in that farmhouse that night. Pilsen sighed, and then he nodded. You're right. You do need answers. I know that I'm not the only one with an election to think about. Chapter 26. The Dracula Murders. Shortly after Mr. Pilsen turned to Black Deer Falls, he leaked the details of Marie's confession to the press. In the interest of journalistic integrity, I can't say for certain that it was him, but who else would it have been? He'd kept it quiet all this time, fearing ridicule, but he didn't need to now that he had a reasonable explanation. So he let it out, about the blood drinker and about the nature of Nathaniel Cody and Marie's relationship. Cody instantly became the most wanted man in America. Marie became a joke. The papers took to calling the murders the Dracula murders again, and this time, as farce, they ridiculed Marie for girlish silliness in the same article that condemned her to death. My father and I weren't spared either. They called us rubies. They said we crushed through our forest armed with rifles and wooden crosses, hunting monsters, too stupid to realize that Marie probably took the idea from their very own headlines. Hadn't they coined them the Dracula murders all the way back in August? The reporters took the explanation of Marie's stepfather and ran with it, forgetting all about the missing blood, the missing prints, the symbol carved into Steve Carlson's headstone, and other questions about the case that still remained. To the public at large, the mystery of the bloodless murders had been solved, and attention turned to other things. In Black Deer Falls, that meant things like transferring Marie out of her jail for trial and sentencing, and holding a special recall election for county sheriff. The whole town was ashamed of us for listening to her story, and my father didn't defend himself. He didn't tell them why he thought it was worth listening to. I guess it just wasn't his way. At school, kids laughed at me. They threw things. They'd trip me in a crowd, or someone would run up from behind and shove me before running off again. And Percy showed up in the cafeteria with a blackening eye. Never mind it, he said, and before I could ask. It was a fair fight. You could even say I won. Who was it? I demanded.